name is Rashid, and I'm 43 years old now. I died on that operating table, and when I opened my eyes, I wasn't standing before Allah like I'd been taught my entire life. I was standing before Jesus Christ, and everything I knew shattered in an instant. But let me take you back to the beginning, because you need to understand where I came from. My earliest memory is of prayer. I couldn't have been more than 4 years old, kneeling on a thin rug in our cramped apartment, watching my father prostrate himself toward Mecca. The community we belonged to called themselves the true followers, the pure ones who understood Islam in ways the corrupted outside world had forgotten. They were wrong, but I didn't know that then. We lived in a compound with about 60 other families. High walls surrounded us, keeping the world out and keeping us in. My childhood was a series of rigid schedules and absolute rules. We prayed 5 times a day, but not like regular Muslims. Our prayers were longer, more intense, filled with recitations our leader had added to the traditional words. He said Allah had given him special revelation, that he was chosen to guide us to paradise. I remember the fear, more than anything else. Fear of displeasing Allah, fear of breaking a rule I didn't even know existed, fear of the punishments that came swift and harsh for any disobedience. The leader, we called him teacher, had eyes that seemed to see straight through to your sins. He knew everything, or so we believed. He told us the outside world was full of demons and unbelievers who would corrupt our souls if we had any contact with them. My parents were completely devoted. My mother covered herself from head to toe in black, even at home. My father worked in the community's carpentry shop, and every penny he earned went to teacher for the good of our people. We owned almost nothing. Possessions were vanity, teacher said. Only our devotion to Allah mattered, and our devotion had to be proven through absolute submission to teacher's authority. I was taught to read using only approved texts. The Quran, but only the parts teacher selected. Books he had written himself, claiming divine inspiration. Stories of the prophets, but twisted to fit his narrative of separation and superiority. I learned that Christians were the worst of all unbelievers because they committed shirk, the unforgivable sin of associating partners with Allah. They worshipped a man, Jesus, as if he were God. This was blasphemy of the highest order. By the time I was 7, I could recite hours of prayers and religious text. I knew exactly how to wash before prayer, how to bow, how to position my hands. I knew which foods were forbidden, which thoughts were sinful, which questions were dangerous. I never played like normal children. Play was frivolous. Every moment was to be spent in service to Allah or in preparation for service. The compound had a school where teachers' sons taught us. We learned basic reading and math, but mostly we learned obedience. We learned that we were special, chosen, better than everyone outside our walls. We learned that suffering in this life was proof of our righteousness. The more we sacrificed, the more assured our place in paradise. I believed every word. How could I not? It was all I knew. The high walls of our compound were the boundaries of my entire universe, and teacher's voice was the voice of ultimate truth. Teacher's interpretation of Islam consumed every aspect of our existence. We didn't just follow the 5 pillars. We followed hundreds of additional requirements that he claimed Allah had revealed to him in visions. Every detail of life was regulated, monitored, and judged. We woke at 4 in the morning for the first prayer, but we also had to perform specific ablutions that took nearly an hour. We had to recite particular verses in a particular order while washing each body part exactly 7 times. If you lost count, you started over. If your mind wandered even for a moment, you started over. I spent so many mornings shivering in cold water, desperately trying to keep my focus, terrified that one mistake would nullify my prayer and anger Allah. The dress code went far beyond modesty. Men wore only white or black, no patterns, no decoration. Women were never seen without full covering. Even little girls over the age of 5 had to cover their hair. Teacher said that vanity was a disease of the soul, and that our appearance should reflect our inner purity and submission. Food was another battleground for righteousness. We ate only what was prepared within the compound. Meat had to be slaughtered in a specific way by specific men who had maintained ritual purity. We fasted not just during Ramadan, but for additional weeks throughout the year that teacher designated. During these fasts, we consumed nothing from sunrise to sunset, and even at night we ate only plain rice and vegetables. Teacher said our bodies were vessels that needed to be purified through denial. Paradise, as teacher described it, was worth any sacrifice. He painted vivid pictures of gardens and rivers, of peace and pleasure beyond imagination. But the path to paradise was narrow and steep. One major sin could doom you to hell forever. And sin was everywhere, lurking in every thought, every glance, every moment of pleasure or comfort. Hell was even more vividly described. Teacher spent hours detailing the torments awaiting those who disobeyed. Fire that burned but never consumed. Thirst that was never quenched. Eternal separation from Allah's mercy. He made us visualize these punishments, made us imagine our own skin burning, our own throats crying out for water that would never come. This was what awaited anyone who questioned, anyone who wavered, anyone who failed to meet the standard of absolute devotion. I lived in a state of constant anxiety. Was I praying correctly? Had I performed my ablutions properly? Had I harbored an impure thought? Every night I lay awake reviewing my day, counting my failures, begging Allah for forgiveness. I was never good enough. None of us were. That was the point. Teacher kept us in a perpetual state of spiritual desperation, always striving, never achieving, always dependent on his guidance to even hope for salvation. Christians were our theological enemies. Teacher taught us that they had corrupted the pure message of Jesus, who was just a prophet, nothing more. They claimed he was the Son of God, which was the worst form of shirk. They said he died on a cross for sins, which made no sense. Allah required personal righteousness, personal sacrifice, personal submission. There was no shortcut, no savior, no grace. You earned paradise through your works, or you burned. As I grew older, I became one of teacher's most devoted followers. By the time I was 17, I was helping to teach the younger children. I memorized more scripture than almost anyone else in the community. I fasted longer, prayed harder, and sacrificed more. My dedication earned me a position of respect, and I wore that respect like armor against the gnawing doubts that occasionally surfaced in the darkest hours of night. I married at 19 to a woman teacher selected for me. Amira was quiet, obedient, and as devoted to the community as I was. We had 2 children by the time I was 25. I raised them the same way I had been raised, passing down the fear and the rules and the desperate striving for an approval that never quite came. But cracks were forming in my certainty, hairline fractures I tried desperately to ignore. The first crack appeared when I was about 22. One of our families had a daughter who became severely ill. She was burning with fever, delirious, and weak. The parents went to teacher, begging for permission to take her to a hospital. Teacher refused. He said that hospitals were places of unbelief, that doctors practiced a kind of sorcery that displeased Allah. He prescribed prayer and fasting instead. I watched that little girl die over the course of 2 weeks. I watched her parents prostrate themselves before Allah, begging for healing that never came. I watched teacher explain that her death was Allah's will, that perhaps there was hidden sin in the family that required this punishment. The parents accepted this. They blamed themselves. But I couldn't shake the image of that child's suffering face. The second crack came when I witnessed teacher's eldest son beating his wife in the courtyard. She had apparently prepared his meal incorrectly. He struck her repeatedly while people walked past, eyes averted, saying nothing. When I mentioned it to another elder, he told me that a man had the right to discipline his wife, that this was proper Islamic practice. But something in me recoiled. This wasn't righteousness. This was cruelty. The third crack was more personal. My own son, only 6 years old, asked me a simple question. He asked why, if Allah loved us, everything we did seemed to make him angry. Out of the mouths of children, right? I had no good answer. I told him not to question, that doubt was the whisper of Satan, but his question echoed in my mind for months afterward. Still, I pushed down the doubts. I intensified my devotion. I told myself that my confusion was a test, that Satan was trying to lead me astray. I prayed more, fasted more, studied more. I became almost manic in my religious observance, as if I could drown out the questions with sheer volume of ritual. By the time I reached my late 30s, I had become one of teachers' senior advisors. I helped enforce the rules. I counseled struggling members. I taught classes on proper submission and obedience. On the outside, I was the model believer. On the inside, I was exhausted and empty, running on fumes of fear and habit. I see now that I was terrified of freedom. The compound was my prison, but it was also my identity. Who would I be without these walls, without these rules, without this community that defined every aspect of my existence? The outside world intruded into my carefully controlled existence when I was 38. Teacher's business ventures required more interaction with outsiders, and he needed members he trusted to handle certain transactions. I was chosen because of my loyalty and my ability to keep my eyes down and my interactions minimal. I began making weekly trips to the city to purchase supplies and handle business matters. Teacher gave me strict instructions. Speak only when necessary. Make eye contact with no one. Complete the transaction and return immediately. Do not be contaminated by the world. For the first few months, I followed these instructions perfectly. I moved through the city like a ghost, barely acknowledging the existence of the people around me. But you can only ignore reality for so long when it's pressing in on all sides. The man who ran the hardware supply store was named Marcus. He was older, maybe in his 60s, with kind eyes and a gentle manner. At first, I simply gave him my list and waited in silence while he gathered the items. But Marcus talked. He talked about the weather, about his grandchildren, about nothing in particular. He didn't seem to expect responses, which was good because I didn't give any. One day, I came into his store visibly upset. Teacher had berated me that morning for a minor infraction, and the shame was still burning in my chest. Marcus noticed. He asked if I was all right. I said I was fine, as I had been trained to do. But he persisted gently, not prying, just expressing simple human concern. Something broke in me, not dramatically, just a small crack widening slightly. I found myself telling him I'd had a difficult morning. He nodded with understanding and said something I will never forget. He said, God doesn't want us to live in fear. He wants us to know we're loved. I dismissed it immediately. This man was an unbeliever. He knew nothing of Allah's requirements, but his words stuck with me like a burr, uncomfortable and impossible to shake loose. Over the following months, my interactions with Marcus remained brief but increasingly human. He never preached at me. He never argued with my beliefs. He simply treated me with a kindness and respect I had rarely experienced. He asked about my family. He remembered details I mentioned. He smiled genuinely when I walked in. There was a woman at the bank where I made deposits to. Her name was Sarah. She also showed me unexpected kindness. When I fumbled with the paperwork, she helped patiently instead of showing irritation. When I asked a question, she answered without condescension. These small acts of grace were foreign to me. In the compound, everything was transactional. You performed, you obeyed, you earned your place. But these people gave kindness freely, expecting nothing in return. I began to notice other things on my trips to the city. Families laughing together in parks, strangers helping each other, people who seemed at peace without following the rigid rules that governed my every moment. They were supposed to be miserable, lost in sin and confusion. Teacher had always said the outside world was chaos and darkness. But what I saw was often more peaceful than what I experienced within our walls. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Everything I had been taught said these people were doomed, corrupted, enemies of truth. But they showed me more compassion than many of my own community members did. The physical symptoms started subtly when I was 41. Chest pain that I attributed to stress. Shortness of breath that I blamed on my frequent fasting. Fatigue that seemed reasonable given my rigorous schedule of prayers and duties. I was waking at 4 every morning and rarely sleeping before midnight. My body was simply tired. That's what I told myself. But the symptoms worsened. The chest pain became more frequent, sharper, radiating down my left arm. I would sometimes break into cold sweats during prayer. My heart would race for no apparent reason, pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I went to teacher, as we were required to do with all matters of health. He placed his hand on my chest and prayed over me. He told me that my symptoms were spiritual in nature, that I was being attacked because of my faithfulness. Satan was trying to weaken me, to remove me from my position of service. The solution was more prayer, more fasting, more dedication. So that's what I did. I intensified everything. I added extra prayers throughout the night. I extended my fasts. I pushed my body harder, believing that spiritual discipline would overcome physical weakness. Looking back now, I see how dangerous this was. But when you've been conditioned your entire life to distrust your own judgment and defer to authority, you do what you're told, even when your body is screaming at you to stop. My wife noticed the decline. Amira begged me quietly, carefully, to seek medical help, but that would require admitting that teachers' prayers weren't working, that spiritual solutions weren't sufficient. That felt like a crisis of faith I couldn't afford to have. I told her to trust Allah, to trust teachers' guidance. I see now how I prioritized ideology over wisdom, how I sacrificed my health on the altar of religious loyalty. The community's response to illness was always the same. Sickness was either a test of faith, a punishment for hidden sin, or a spiritual attack from Satan. The solution was always spiritual, never practical. We had members who suffered from treatable conditions, who never received proper care because teacher viewed modern medicine with deep suspicion. He called hospitals temples of secular humanism and doctors priests of false knowledge. Think about your own life for a moment. When something is wrong with your body, you seek help. It's common sense, but common sense had been systematically stripped from us. We had been taught that our instincts were corrupted, that our reasoning was flawed, that only teachers' interpretation of Allah's will could be trusted. The pain continued for months. There were moments when I honestly thought I might die, and in those moments, I felt a strange mixture of fear and relief. Fear because I wasn't certain I had done enough to earn paradise. Relief because I was so tired of striving, so exhausted from the endless performance of righteousness. Death would at least be rest. But I survived those episodes, and each time I did, teacher pointed to it as proof that his prayers were working, that Allah was sustaining me through faith alone. The community celebrated my endurance as a testimony of spiritual strength. I was held up as an example of how devotion could overcome physical weakness. The crisis came on a Tuesday morning during the second prayer. I was prostrated on the floor, forehead pressed to the ground, reciting the prescribed words when the pain exploded in my chest like nothing I had ever experienced. It felt like someone had reached inside my rib cage and was crushing my heart in their fist. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I collapsed fully onto the floor, gasping, my vision narrowing to a small tunnel of light surrounded by encroaching darkness. Men around me continued praying. In our community, you didn't break prayer for anything short of death. Even as I lay there struggling, most of them kept their eyes closed, their focus on their recitations. My son, 12 years old now, was the one who finally broke protocol. He shouted for help, running to find the elders. By the time they reached me, I was barely conscious. The pain was so intense that I was beyond fear. I existed only in that moment of agony, my entire world reduced to the desperate attempt to draw one more breath. Teacher was summoned. He arrived and immediately began to pray over me, loudly rebuking Satan and calling on Allah to heal me. But even through the haze of pain, I could see the alarm in the eyes of some of the other men. One of them, a younger member who had more contact with the outside world, whispered urgently that I needed a hospital. Teacher resisted. He said that taking me to a hospital would be an admission that our faith was insufficient. He wanted to continue praying, to trust Allah to heal me supernaturally. But the pain was worsening, and even in my semi-conscious state, I could hear the argument escalating around me. My wife made the decision. Emira, who had been silent and obedient for 20 years of marriage, stood up to teacher for the first time in her life. She told them they were calling an ambulance, and if anyone tried to stop her, she would run into the street screaming for help until someone called one. Her voice was shaking, but determined. She was willing to risk everything, even excommunication, to save my life. Teacher finally relented, but his expression made it clear that this was a failure of faith. He warned that if I went to the hospital, I was putting my trust in man rather than Allah, and there would be spiritual consequences. The ambulance arrived within minutes, though it felt like hours. Paramedics rushed in with equipment and questions I couldn't answer. They loaded me onto a stretcher, attached monitors, started an IV. The compound members watched in silence, and I could feel their judgment even through my pain. I was the one who couldn't endure. I was the one whose faith had failed. The ride to the hospital was a blur of sirens and urgent voices. The paramedics were communicating in medical terminology I didn't understand. Vital signs, cardiac event, possible MI, ST elevation. The words meant nothing to me, but the tone said everything. I was dying. In the emergency room, more people surrounded me. Doctors, nurses, technicians. They cut away my shirt. They attached more monitors. Someone was shouting orders. Someone else was explaining that they needed to take me to surgery immediately. My heart was failing. There was a blockage. Minutes mattered.